Welcome to another episode of They Not Like Us. I'm your host, Aaron, and today we have an incredible conversation lined up. But before we dive in, I want to remind you to hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening. By subscribing, you'll never miss out on the amazing guests we bring on to share their insights, stories, and strategies for success. We're all about helping you level up in life, whether it's business, personal growth, or overcoming the challenges you face. So if you're ready to be inspired and take action, make sure you're subscribed so you stay up to date with every new episode. And don't forget to leave a review. It helps us continue to bring you top-notch content every week. Let's jump in. Hello, welcome back to They Not Like Us. I'm your host, Aaron, and today I'm with KrIstal DeSantis. Is that pronounced correct, KrIstal?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Welcome to the show, KrIstal.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It's my pleasure. Can you tell people a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. So I am in Austin, Texas, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also am an author. I wrote a book last year that just came out last year. So that's what I do for work. As a person, I enjoy cooking and eating and traveling. And I am married, and me and my husband, we have 3 children that have 4 legs. We have 3 animal kids, and then he has a child, and so I'm a bonus parent. So that's kind of the constellation of my life right now.
Cool. How is Austin, Texas?
Right now in this moment is ACL is going on, so it's very vibrant right now. So ACL, the big music festival, got a lot of people coming in for this. So it's a very exciting time in Austin. A lot of stuff.
Is it a good place to live? I hear a lot of good things about Texas.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is very hot. I mean, it's October, and I'm in sleepless. Like it was 90 degrees yesterday, so it's still pretty warm. So if you don't mind the heat, it's not a bad place to be.
It's got to be better than the UK. It's just dark and wet and miserable here all the time.
There's something to be said for balance. Maybe everyone just needs to migrate in the winters and take a page out of the bird's book.
Yeah, definitely. That'll suit me. Need some of that sunshine in my life, and then I don't have to take so much vitamin D tablets.
All right.
So, obviously, your expertise, KrIstal, is in sort of relationships mostly.
Mm-hmm.
So, what kind of work are you doing at the minute?
So right now, I work with either people who are trying to figure out their own relationship with themselves and maybe with dating. And so those are kind of my individual clients. And then I also work with couples who are, and maybe at some point in their relationship where they need a little bit more support, or they're just looking to enhance their relationship, right? Maybe they have a lot of stuff going for them, but they just feel like they could be more connected. They could have better communication. So that's really the population that I have in my office right now, either people who have experienced trauma or who want to kind of heal their relationship with themselves, who are trying to make new relationships. They're in dating and they're trying to, navigate what it's like to form a relationship in this day and age, or people that are in long-term relationships, who are trying to kind of just get themselves back on track.
Yeah, it can be difficult relationships, right? And we all go through phases, ups and downs, and
Absolutely.
it can be difficult. You said something about sort of the modern day, really, how to cope in this kind of modern day era and environment. What's kind of one thing about modern society that approaches love and relationships? What would you change? So, what kind of things do you see regularly that you would change?
So, I mean, there's a lot, and actually, right now we're in a very interesting time. I think just as a society, and I say that like really broadly, in that back in the day, maybe a couple generations ago, being in a relationship was something that you just kind of had to do in order to exist in a society. And I'm talking specifically about like a marriage or a partnered relationship, right? We're all in relationships of one kind or another, family relationships, all of that. But it was kind of expected that at some point you find a husband, you find a wife, you get married, you have kids, you kind of, follow the script. Um, and right now, I think we're just in a really interesting place as a society in the modern world, all over the world, where that script is not necessarily written in stone anymore. And people are trying to figure out, like, is marriage part of my future, what I see for myself? Are children really something I want to kind of invest in and do that path or not? And I think it's really the first time in history where people actually had the choice. And we don't quite know what that looks like yet. So
Yeah, I worry what that looks like in kind of older age when when we're done with our partying phase or enjoying our life and our career come to an end, and then what are we left with at that stage? That's what I worry about.
yeah, but I think that's really where this is where a lot of people are at, right? Because in the past, people relied on the relationships because of the obligation of the structure, right? So, like, if you were a child, even if your parents didn't treat you right, like you had an obligation to take care of them in their older age, right? Um, but now it's kind of like what you said of like, sure, we want to have relationships that last us throughout our lives, but I think the realization is now you actually have to be invested in them. They don't just stay there because they have to anymore. Does that make sense a little bit?
Yeah, it does. And I think, society's shifted as well, hasn't it, over the past sort of, I don't know, probably like 100 years, I suppose. But,
Yeah.
as time's gone on and on, women have become more and more independent, whereas they always used to be the one that held that family together, really. They were always that
Hmm.
linchpin, holding
Yeah.
that family together. And I think now that women are more successful, more out in the workplace,
Hmm.
more career orientated, that's kind of
Hmm.
shifted that dynamic a bit. And I don't think everybody's quite adjusted to get that balance right yet. To
Totally.
because
Yeah.
especially the men, I suppose, because we are useless. We need pointing in the right direction all the time.
Yeah. Well, I think I want to give credit to both sides, right? Is that I think what's like you said, what has happened is a lot of the times it was women that were keeping these relationships together, and then women started to realize like how much work that is. And so they're much more careful about choosing to put themselves in those positions now. And so nobody's taking those positions, right? So in an ideal world, right, in the future, it would be that everybody who's invested in the relationship can hold it together or play their own role in holding it together, right? Like, yes, mom calls the kids, but so does dad. And then the kids call their parents. It's not just the parents call the kids, right? And so I think we're at that new kind of era of like figuring out what does it actually mean to be in relationship with people and what does it actually take to keep relationships together over a lifespan where people aren't just living in the same 5 mile radius, they go to the same church, they go to the same school, and you have a relationship because there they are, you know. They're not going anywhere. And so the challenge of the modern relationship, not just the romantic one, but in so many other ways, friendships, parent-child relationships, is how do we all be invested in holding something together where in the past we relied on external circumstances or the one person. Mom was the glue of or grandma was the glue of the family. And instead, how can we make it a shared endeavor and a shared investment? And that's really hard, as anybody who's ever worked on a group project can tell you. Like, figuring out like, wait, whose job is that? And why am I more invested than that person? And figuring out all of those dynamics is a lot more challenging than just they'll delegate that person and they take care of it, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think it's the balance that we need to find as well, because life isn't linear. So sometimes the man, for instance, might have to pick up the slack, and then other times
Yeah.
the woman might have to pick up the slack. Or obviously, if it's a same sex marriage, well, the other partner. But it's
Hmm.
it's about finding that balance, and like if somebody is going through a difficult time and in a difficult place, then the other one picks up the slack, and vice versa,
Hmm.
to try and find that
Hmm.
balance to keep moving forward. Really.
Yeah. And that's where it's challenging because it requires two people to have almost the same capacity for the same skill in relationships, right? Is that like, yeah, if I'm not feeling well and I ask you to pick up the slack, but then you don't know how to do it, then there's no equality, right? And so I think that's where a lot of modern relationships are being challenged of like, wait, how do we divide all of this? How do we show up as equal? Um, if, yeah, if the traditional way of kind of, you stay in your lane, I stay in mine, I will never ask you to pick up my slack because that's my job. And like, you will never ask me to pick up your slack because that's your job, which is a lot of how traditional relationships worked, right? It was like, maybe just being really broad and stereotypic, but like, there are some relationships where like grandpa would never have been asked to change a diaper. Like, what? No, he, does the man stuff. He goes out and make a paycheck. And, grandpa would never ask grandma to get a job. Like, no, she stays home, and so I think that's really what the challenge is now is like everybody has to kind of do everything. Um, and it's a lot. It's a lot to be an adult and have a life and have a relationship and raise children. It's a lot.
Therefore, life is hard, man. Life is hard.
Yeah.
So, what's a common piece of relationship advice that you actually disagree with?
Ooh. Um, okay, well, it's easy. That's the easy one. The happy wife, happy life one. I actually put that in the prologue of my book as like it's one of the worst myths. Um, because again, it really goes on that old model of like it's, you know, uh, first of all, underlying that is like the man's needs doesn't matter, right? It's like if your wife's happy, you should be happy, suck it up. Like it's how it is. Happy wife, happy life. So I really don't like that one. Um, yeah, that's that.
Yeah, that's a fair one. I still hear that a lot.
Which the reason I don't like it so much is because it doesn't actually work, you know? It's like I think maybe there's a there's a which like so many things, right? When they get distilled down into a soundbite, sometimes it loses the the nuance, right? It's like, of course you want your wife to be happy. Great. But what about your happiness, right? But then if it was like, you know, I don't know, just being able to say like yes and yes, having a happy wife is a good thing and your happiness matters.
Yeah, I think that's the problem, and I think the internet doesn't help because all these sound bites or like extreme
Oh yeah.
views get
Yeah.
they get more airtime. People pay more attention to them because it polarizes people. But
Hmm.
usually the answer somewhere in the middle, and there's balance to everything. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
But if somebody's setting out in a relationship now, then so if they're early stages of a relationship, what do you think would best set them up for long-term success?
Um, so I I mean, self-awareness, that's number one, is, knowing what makes you happy, knowing what you're looking for, knowing what your strengths are, knowing what your challenges are, knowing just who you are is the number one thing that leads to long-term success in relationships. Because when you know who you are, you can be honest about um, like what you need in order to function and thrive in a relationship, right? As so many people, when they're dating, especially with these apps and these online things, it's about presenting an idealized version of yourself. And I think I see a lot of people, they try really hard to be that idealized version, but it's unless it's hard to keep that up over time, right? Unless you're really actually making the changes to be that person. Um, and so that like being self-aware enough to say, you know what, I might not be the idealized version of myself now, but I would like to find a partner who's okay with the version of me that is right now, with the knowledge that I am constantly striving to better myself. And they will support that and they will be generous and kind and allow for my humanity. I'm not, the perfect person, the perfect version of me, but it's okay because I'm self-aware and I'm open to accepting their humanity as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Ultimately, it's about that willingness to be vulnerable, isn't it? That's how we build true, deep relationships. Because when we pretend
Hmm.
that we're perfect and we hide all these things, and we wear this
Hmm.
mask to make out like we're something we're not, then you know there's a cost to that, and that cost
Hmm.
is that deeper, meaningful relationship because you're hiding, who you are really.
Yeah. Which, again, there's a deeper conversation here about like how men have been socialized to present themselves as very competent and capable, right? I know we've heard these kind of stereotypic jokes of like, the man who doesn't want to ask for directions because he doesn't want to appear that he doesn't know what he's doing, or he's like, I got that, I'll fix the sink. And, you're like, you're not a plumber, just call a plumber, like, but again, that acknowledging that pressure that a lot of men have felt for a very long time to like, if you don't know the answer, at least pretend like you do, or like this is something that's like masculine, that you're the guy that is very competent. I got it. I can do it. Yeah, I know that. I know that. Um, and there's a vulnerability involved in saying like, I don't know how to do that, or yeah, maybe I do need some help. Which it, again, there's a lot of women that haven't quite gotten around to the idea that, oh yeah, men are people, and maybe sometimes a man it is vulnerable, and it's okay, and it's safe to be vulnerable. So I think we're at this really, again, still interesting place in society where I think we're starting to allow for vulnerability in that way, that you don't have to know everything, you don't have to be everything, but it's still not 100% safe to do that in some relationships. So,
Yeah, and I think that's what everybody worries about is about being vulnerable, showing who they truly are, and then being
mhm.
rejected. Because I think that probably that's what they protect themselves from, isn't it? Really.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a super valid fear. And, again, there's um, a lot of negative consequences for men to start showing vulnerability, um, especially with all of the stigma and all of the historical um, negative consequences that men have received for showing that and for being honest about their vulnerabilities. Yeah, so it's tough.
Yeah, I will say though, it's not just men because I come from a line of very, very stubborn men and women who refuse to
Uh-huh.
ask for help but refuse to show any weakness and will persevere no
Sure.
matter what.
Yeah. Which, it is really interesting because it is, I almost think of it sometimes as like when you show, I work with a lot of high functioning people like that, right? So a lot of men, but you're right, some women too. And it's basically, sometimes I talk about it like I have a wall in my office that's a stone wall. And it's like, I don't know if anyone's ever tried to boulder or climb, if anyone's a climber, it's like when there's a smooth wall, there's no points of connection. There's no points to grab onto. And right. And so when people are like smooth and perfect and they never show vulnerability, they're like a granite slab. And it's like it's really difficult to connect with that. Whereas when you're like a little bit rough, a little bit, you know, some cracks are showing, it's like it actually allows the spaces for people to connect and grab hold and find little points of connection. um yeah, so it's just that kind of like when you're smooth and perfect, you're beautiful, but there's not a lot of room points for connection, whereas the rough and all of that might not be as quote unquote perfect looking, but there's a lot more points for connection.
Yeah, I like that analogy. Reminds me a little bit of karaoke. Whenever you go to karaoke, if the singer's really, really good, you're just like, well, I might as well go to a concert. It's
Right.
fun. It's fun when they're imperfect.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a great one. Yeah. It's like we actually have a real soft spot for kind of imperfect things as long as it's, like a safe environment to have that connection in.
Yeah, and the imperfections is what makes people unique as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's the human part of us.
Yeah, and it makes us feel more human as well, I suppose. Because if we've got somebody who's pretending to be or is perfect, then we just feel like we're not worthy or we're not, you know, we don't measure up really.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. And I've, you know, met with and worked with some of those perfect people, and like it's really exhausting to be that perfect all the time because it's not super natural. So you have to work really, really hard to not, because it's not actually being perfect, it's presenting as perfect, right? And so that's like it's a whole production. and it takes a lot of energy, and it's quite exhausting, and it can be very lonely too, right? Because you're very invested in like making sure no one sees behind the curtain, behind the wall. So you can, yeah, it's just, it takes a lot of mental energy to present as perfect. Um, yeah, exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah, keeping people out is again it stops that connection, doesn't it? So it's difficult.
Yeah.
What's the most rewarding part of your job then?
Oh gosh. I mean, getting to see people learn to connect with themselves, right? And then connect with others. So that is just, I mean, at the end of the day, like that's really what humans are wired for, right? We all want to connect. We all want to feel like we belong. We all want, those moments of connection that we feel like we're in flow, or we're like, oh my gosh, like we just feel so seen. Um, and that's kind of like what we're born with. That's our DNA. And then we grow up in a world that punishes us for being human and tells us that, we need to be more perfect, or we need to be better and have higher grades. And like, and so really it's about like uncovering all of the adaptations that people have developed in order to keep them safe in a really sometimes unforgiving world, and really allowing them to kind of come back to their like, oh my gosh, I really am like, I'm a really cool person, and I really like when I connect with myself, who I am, and I can reconnect with what I loved about me when I was a kid. I remember I thought I was going to be an astronaut, and I just was like such a vibrant kid. And now I'm like cynical, and think the worst of people, and like all of that. And I just, so allowing people to go back and connect with those kind of core parts of themselves, and then seeing them be able to share that with somebody they love, whether it's a friend, whether it's they call their sibling and they're like, hey bud, haven't, like be able to connect with them in a different way, that's less guarded and more vulnerable, more honest. Or with couples, seeing them be able to connect like from a, not from a protection place of like, you're the enemy, I'm gonna win this one, but instead really kind of showing up and being like, hey, wait a minute, we love each other, right? Like we're on the same side, right? We're ride or die, right? Okay, so then if I'm using that like way of relating to you, I just want to share this with you because you're my person. And that, like watching that change happen from like protection to people that are like protected to then opening up and connecting is like love.
Yeah, that must be amazing being a part of that, doing that work. I've personally been on my own journey trying to kind of free myself really and just be happy in myself and more vulnerable and open and stuff like that. And it is so freeing. It just makes you, so much happier and more childlike almost. You just take more joy out of
Yes.
things.
And I don't know if you resonate or you can relate to this, but like the amount of work that you don't realize you're doing until you stop doing it. Like, the work of like trying to be a certain way in the world, or trying to present or show up in a certain way, like to be able to have that relief of like, oh, I can just be me, huh? You just don't almost yeah, just realizing like, oh, I don't have to work so hard.
Yeah, it's
Kind of
amazing.
lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. What's the most courageous thing someone could do for the sake of their relationship?
Oh my gosh. I think honestly, just people even showing up to talk about their relationship in a therapy setting is still a very courageous thing, especially for, especially with some of the population I work with. I work often with a lot of first responder men and veteran couples, and a lot of that is, there's some maybe stigma around therapy and like mental health. And so even just the courage of saying like, all right, I will walk into a room with a stranger and I will tell my story, and I'll be open to hearing yours, and I'm willing to like maybe look at what I could do to change to make our relationship better. Like just that. And I mean, walking into the first session is really, really courageous for a lot of people. It's just that first step of saying like, maybe I do need, or I could use some help here. Um, and that's huge. Yeah, it's a lot.
Absolutely. I think as well, therapy gets a bad rep. A lot of people will try it. Yeah, not just marriage therapy or marriage counseling,
Hmm.
anything like that. It's just all therapy gets a bad rep because I think people will go, they won't open up. They'll just go and be shut down. They might not
Yeah.
necessarily connect with the therapist, and then they'll
Hmm.
be like, "Oh, it doesn't work. Awful. It doesn't work." They don't give it a chance. They
Yeah,
don't try other people to see if they can build a relationship with the therapist because ultimately that's a relationship as well, and you need to kind of build that relationship to
absolutely.
make that work. So, do you find you get
Absolutely.
much of that?
Yeah, I really, I definitely, I was thinking, I don't know why, well, maybe because I was just watching it. Do you watch, or have you ever seen the show Love is Blind?
No, I've seen it advertised, but I've never seen it.
Okay. So I guess I don't know. It's kind of like dating, right? Sometimes I talk to people about like dating of like you go, on a first date and you're kind of excited and you're like sharing something about yourself and it doesn't land or you just don't vibe with the other person. Like it can be very discouraging because you put yourself out there, you like worked hard to like get ready and go, and maybe you had a lot of high hopes. So I completely understand how that can feel very like ugh, it's not even like what's the point, right? And sometimes that can feel like that after going to, a first therapy session with a therapist who's not a good fit for you. Is that real like disappointment after a first date that didn't turn out to be your person? Um, and so I just like want to validate that like yeah it is very very hard because there is something about the chemistry of like being open and vulnerable but also recognizing that if you go on a first date and you're like here's all my stuff it still also might not feel that great when you leave and it's not a good fit. So just yeah being able to say both and like, I really appreciate the people that come in, and if I'm not your person, I still really appreciate the fact that you were brave enough to come in and give it a chance. And maybe it's then my goal is to help you find that therapist that is your person. But eventually, it's about like it's kind of like dating. You got to find the one for you, and sometimes that's tough.
Yeah, it can be tough, and I think people are too quick to give up. And I think I also do think that it's like, and I've used this analogy before. It's like giving up smoking. If you don't want to give
Mm,
up, no matter how many patches you use or what tablets you take, or if you vape as well, whatever you start doing to try and quit, if you don't really want to quit, you won't.
yeah, yeah. And I'm a big fan of don't do things you don't want to do unless you're ready to do them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Are there is there any specific moment in your life that's kind of changed the way that you view relationships or connection?
I mean, I think there's a lot of moments. When I met my husband, I think that was a huge um, moment for me, just because up until that point, so I was not always on the path to be a marriage therapist. I was, working in PR, working in a completely different field. And I was trying to date, and I was, but I wasn't very vulnerable, let's be honest. I was kind of like, I'm really career focused right now. And, I dated, but it was just like I didn't put a lot of investment into it. I didn't open up a lot. So, no wonder these relationships were fairly shallow. But I met my husband, and suddenly I was like, oh, I actually want a deeper connection, but I don't know how. And so that's really where I think it started to sink in for me that if I want a deeper relationship and a more fulfilling commitment, then I also need to look at my blocks to allowing that to actually happen. And that it's not like magic that when you meet the right person, like boom, fireworks, and suddenly you're going to have all the skills to like be vulnerable and be open. Is I was like, I know this is the one, but I don't know what to do about that, you know? Um, and so that I think was really profound for me in realizing that there would be some work that I would have to do to be ready for that level of vulnerability, so that I could have the relationship that I wanted. It wasn't just going to happen by magic. Um, and he couldn't do all the work to just like, you know, make the relationship work if I didn't do my part. So that's when I went to therapy.
Yeah, it's constant work, right? For both parties, and that's it. We've got to try and
Hmm.
work together and grow together, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a full-time job.
Absolutely. Is there
Mhm.
any belief that you once held about relationships that you've completely changed your mind on?
Let me think. I think just again, like maybe before being a therapist, I thought And I guess the idea that divorce is like the worst thing that could ever happen, um, which it is still very sad, right? And like my job now is like helping couples, prevent and avoid divorce. However, I've seen divorce be a very healthy thing for some couples that maybe were never supposed to be together. They never like they just, again, they maybe were following a script and they ended up in a marriage, and then they realized like either the other person wasn't helping make the marriage work, or certain things like the other person was in active addiction or something, that they just weren't showing up. um, and that actually divorce can be a very, or even if, let's say, there wasn't any like major terrible thing, it's simply that two people can decide that their marriage or their relationship has come to an end, and they can continue to support each other and support a life that allows both of them to thrive in different ways. I think that is something that, it like really, it challenged me to think about, like, okay, you know, is a marriage or a relationship ending mean that it was a failure, or is it just a transformation? And of course, there are a lot of factors, and this is not a soundbite, so it's a very complicated, complex, nuanced, uh, event in people's lives. But that is something that I think I've shifted a lot in that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And ultimately, sometimes we grow apart, not just love relationships. In all relationships, sometimes we can
Yeah,
grow apart, or one grows and the other doesn't, and we can go in separate directions, and that happens, doesn't it? And
yeah.
navigating that is difficult also.
Yeah, it's like there can be such a thing as a respectful ending. And that's actually what I do with some of my couples now. And that's a service that I've gotten trained in and I offer, is what's called discernment counseling, and then like conscious uncoupling, right? And so being able to say, like, there's a respectful and loving way to transition out of a relationship that honors, it's not this binary of like, you have to hate your ex now that you've divorced them or that you've separated. And I think there's a lot of maybe that messaging out there that either you're meant to be and you're together forever, or you're over and they were a terrible person. And it's like, well, no, there's actually like a respectful way that you can end a relationship that honors what you got out of it, and also honors that, like, you're going to another chapter.
Yeah, I think from my experience, we're awful at that doing it well. And
Yeah.
everybody just either waits for something to go wrong or creates something bad to make it happen, and it always seems to go badly.
Yeah. Yeah. Not the healthiest.
No, not at all. What's a common fear or insecurity then that people seem to struggle with in relationships, but rarely admit?
That how hard asking for what you need is. I think a lot of people are like, that's part of the thing, right? It's like being vulnerable is asking for what you need and trusting that your partner cares enough about you to try to meet your need, or at least acknowledge that you have a need. Um, and I see a lot of people who struggle to even acknowledge that they have needs, or they're like, no, no, I'm not the needy one in this relationship. And they're like, well, if you're human, you have needs. So, but it is kind of difficult sometimes to get to that place where you can ask for what you need, and you believe that your partner cares enough about you and your well-being that they actually want to help meet your need, or that they'll at least acknowledge it. Like, that's a pretty tough place that I see people struggle with a lot, and it's scary.
Yeah, I get that. From the other perspective, then, from the other partner's point of view, how do they create that space to make it okay for the partner to do that?
Yeah, and that's where being really patient, really doing a lot of active listening, and also, you know, one of the things that sometimes comes up when somebody is trying to express a need they have is sometimes it comes out as, maybe projection or an attack on the other person. And so being boundaried and self-aware enough to ask them to restate without attacking back. Does that make sense? So like if I'm asking one person to be like, can you state what you need? And they might say something like, well, you never asked me how my day was. And so then the other person's job is, rather than responding to that of like, what are you saying? I just asked you yesterday. is being patient enough and aware enough to say, okay, can you tell me what your need is under that? And then it really bounces the ball back to, well, you never asked me, and that hurts my feelings because I want to be asked. Okay, now we're getting somewhere, right? And so participating in the cycle of health rather than the cycle of harm to the relationship is where the other person comes in. Right? It's like you can shoot them right back into that conflict cycle by matching that energy, or you can hold and pause and give them the opportunity to restate it. And that's really where like then the growth happens.
Yeah, that's the difference between listening to understand and listening to just respond, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's about asking those extra questions and getting into the detail of it and
Hmm.
figuring out actually what are they really saying. Because sometimes you'll say something and you haven't actually got to the root of it really.
Yeah. And that's so common, which, yeah, keeps a lot of people stuck in that cycle, right?
Absolutely. What about technology then in modern relationships? How does that kind of influence and impact people?
It is a blessing and a curse, right? It's like it just depends on how it's used. I've seen a lot of couples that would have never been able to keep as in touch as they do without the use of technology, right? It's like if they're long distance or, they have periods of time where they have to be apart or travel, and like using technology as a way to stay connected, even deepen intimacy by, doing things over, using technology is like, it's a way that it can be very, very bonding. And then, of course, it could just be a third or fourth partner in the home that gets in the way of everything. It's like, it's, yeah, the blessing and a curse. It's just really important that couples um, are mindful of their own relationship to technology, right? Yeah.
Yes. Again, it comes down to balance, right? It's getting the balance right. It can be a great tool, but it can also be really, really negative. Is there any kind of
Yeah.
piece of advice that you would give to couples who are trying to kind of, you know, who want to use that technology but kind of want to get the balance right about, getting that deeper connection as well?
I, honestly, what's worked for a lot of couples is, at least creating tech-free zones in your house, whether those are time zones or certain rooms that are tech-free. And trying to have some balance in that way, right? Like we can't always just, you know, turn our phones off at 5 o'clock when the workday ends. But, having at least some kind of boundary around like, I don't know, after 6 o'clock or after 7 o'clock, we have an hour where we just have tech free time for a little bit. We just have dinner together, we just connect, and then we pick our phones back up at 8 or we watch a movie. Like again, we can have technology in our lives, but having these like little tech free zones has been very helpful for a lot of couples to try to find that balance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. To be fair, I'm terrible at it. I'll just sit on my phone and scroll and go down the rabbit hole for forever. Really,
Yeah,
I mean, the apps are designed for that, right? They're good at it. They're good at keeping you on.
exactly. Yeah.
But we spoke briefly at the start about how gender roles have kind of changed and how the balance of stuff is off. A term I hear a lot when I'm doing all my TikTok rabbit hole falling down is toxic masculinity. What's your view on that?
I think it's a term that has completely taken a life of its own and derailed a very important conversation about allowing or making space for the evolution of masculinity to not be so rigid and restricted. I don't really like the word. I don't like the phrase toxic masculinity because I feel like it just derails from the point. But I like what Tony Porter, he talks about this concept of like the man box, which he talks about like restrictive masculinity, of masculinity as like following a certain set of rules. If you complete this checklist, if you stay within these parameters, then congratulations, you have your man card. But it's so fragile because at any moment, oh, is that nail polish? Sorry, man card removed. Or oh, did you just show an emotion? Well, man card removed. And so that kind of restrictive masculinity of like, you know, not allowing men to just be who they are and showing up as a full, full self and not have to be like performative in their masculinity, is I think where the really important conversation should be.
Yeah, toxic masculinity. It is thrown around a lot. It's one of those extremes that are used, and I think for me, I think this toxic behavior that people can, if they are behaving in extreme ways, but that could be on both ends. I don't think it necessarily has anything to do with, masculinity or femininity. It's just, some people take things too far, really. Yeah, and I think there's this kind of view that. If you're a man, you have to be masculine all the time. Whereas actually, there's scales. People are different anyway. So some people are more, some men are more feminine than others. Some men are more masculine than others. And even like me, for instance, I'll sometimes I can be masculine. Sometimes I can be quite feminine. Actually, it depends on. I let my daughter paint my nails and do whatever else. It doesn't bother me. I'm not fussed. I have no. There's no problem with that. So I think again, it comes to that balance and understanding that everybody has a bit of balance and they'll ebb and they'll flow and they'll go back and forth depending on the situation and what's appropriate, really. Yeah, I think it comes down to it's human nature that we want to put everybody in a kind of a category or a box so we can kind of we know that person belongs there, that person belongs there. We could just understand, I don't know if that's like a evolutionary thing from, from groups and stuff. So we could kind of understand and categorize things and make things easier. But I mean, it doesn't work in modern society. There's so much balance and nuance needed now. Yeah. And it makes sense because, when we're early on in our evolution and stuff, we would have had smaller groups, even up until recently, really, when we've now become, globally interconnected, and there's this a massive, huge society, really global society that's all connected and communicating and interacting. Now it's much more complex, and our brains are not quite there. So we have to be aware that our default state is to put people into boxes and categorize things, and then actually take a step back and think, and then try and consider the nuance and the actual, real issues that are at play. I'm not sure. I think mine's hardly working, to be honest. So you mentioned your book briefly. Tell me a little bit about your book. What was the experience like of writing it first? Yeah, it's typical us men, really. We want a manual. We want an instruction guide how to put something together. Yeah, I was just saying, as typical of us men, really. We want a little instruction manual of how to put something together, same as like flat back furniture. How do we put it together? Let's look at this. I'll sort it. Yeah, I think there's some value in that as well, in some, in actually seeing some progress, because then you get more buy-in and you get, you're more invested in it. You think, oh, this is working. And then even if it goes on to the other softer skills, then at least, you've seen some progress, you believe in it, and that's half the battle, really. Absolutely. Yeah, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. And like I say, a lot of the books can be difficult if there's a lot of soft skills. A lot of men will struggle with that. Like I would probably struggle with that as well until I have some sort of traction or momentum, and then at which point I'm invested then, and I'll go down that road. Yeah. So what are some of the key lessons then out of the book that that is strong a model? Is that I love that. That's really, really well put together. I quite I buy into everything you've said there, and it's some of the stuff that we've touched on already anyway. Yeah, I like that. And it comes back to that self-awareness that you said at the beginning as well, is being aware of how you're communicating, what you're doing in the relationship, because we're too quick, I think, to look at the other person and kind of blame the other person for what they are doing or what they're not doing, when we haven't really got our own ducks in a row. How do you help the people that are not? How do you help them kind of get to that point? Yeah, that's massive, right? Getting that figured out. And we all struggle with that, I think. And it's not just relationships, it's life. I think we struggle to figure out what we want and put it all together. Yeah, we're too busy looking out and looking at everybody else and everything else, rather than looking in and trying to figure ourselves out first. And then, because I think if we get ourselves right, or we have that self-awareness, like you say, I think just approaching life will so much easier. Where can people find you, Crystal, if they want to get in touch with you or if they want to get hold of your book? No problem. I'll make sure I drop the links in the show notes for people so they can find you. Before we bring this to a close, is there any final thoughts or anything that you want to leave us with? Absolutely. Crystal, it's been amazing having you on the show. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Take care.
Hey, listeners, if you've been enjoying They Not Like Us, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to leave a positive review and subscribe. It might seem like a small thing, but for an independent podcast like this, it makes a huge difference. Your support helps the show get discovered by more people, allowing us to bring on even more amazing guests and continue sharing content that resonates with you. So, if today's episode or any past ones have sparked something in you, hit that subscribe button and drop a quick review. Your feedback keeps this community growing, and I'm so grateful to have you along for the ride. Thanks so much.